She spent years hiding behind veils, shadows, and thick walls of silence. Everyone in town knew her only through rumors. The ugly girl, the strange one from the house on the hill, the one no one ever saw. But that night, amid rain, lightning, and the rumble of a Harley Davidson, fate knocked on her door with wounded hands and eyes as broken as her own. That's how it all began. The thunder cracked across the sky like a warning. The muddy dirt road, winding between the hills, glistened in patches under the lightning. At times menacing, at others invisible. The motorcycle roared with difficulty, its tires slipping through puddles that kept growing. Caleb squinted, trying to see farther ahead, but the wind drove the rain straight into his face like needles. The Harley shook, and he struggled to keep control. 1 second of distraction was all it took. The front wheel sank into a hidden pothole, and the world spun. The impact with the ground was harsh and brutal. His left shoulder scraped against the wet gravel, his arm was scraped raw, and the bike skidded a few feet ahead before collapsing into the mud. The engine died with a metallic groan. He lay there for a moment, gasping, feeling the rain soak through his clothes. His whole body ached, but nothing seemed broken. He got to his feet, staggering, leaning on one leg. He saw the fallen motorcycle and muttered a quiet curse. He needed help. He looked around, nothing but darkness and dense forest, until in the distance he spotted a flickering light. A house. He limped toward it, each step a battle against the wind. The gate was open. The old wooden porch creaked under his weight. He pounded on the door twice, trying to be heard over the thunder. Bob answered. A man with a stern face, sun-weathered skin, a thin graying beard, and suspicious eyes. He wore a thick coat and held the doorknob like someone who didn't trust anyone. "What is it?" he asked, not taking his eyes off Caleb. "I had an accident. It's on the road. My bike skidded, I'm soaked, and I think I twisted my arm. Can I use the phone?" Caleb tried to smile, but the pain and cold made his voice tremble. Before Bob could answer, a silent presence appeared behind him. In the dim hallway, a young woman stood watching quietly. Her hair was tucked beneath a light scarf, and a thin veil covered her face, leaving only her eyes visible. Large, intense, and filled with restrained curiosity. That was all Caleb saw, the eyes. But it was enough to throw him off for a moment. Bob noticed the way he looked and said in a dry tone, "Ivy, get a towel and make the guy some tea, he's shaking." She obeyed without a word. She disappeared down the hall with light steps, and soon the sound of water filling a kettle echoed from the kitchen. Bob headed out to the barn. The rain was coming down harder again, but he didn't hesitate. He returned, driving an old Hilux, the trailer still caked with dried mud from recent weeks. When he saw the fallen motorcycle, he gave a low whistle. He examined the side and shook his head. "This isn't just any bike," he muttered. Back on the porch, Ivy set a cup of tea on the worn wooden table and looked out the window. Her eyes lit up as she saw her uncle slowly pulling the bike into the garage. "It's a 1908 Harley Davidson strap tank," she whispered to herself, barely believing it. She remembered reading about that rare model in old forums. Once she'd seen one go for nearly $935,000 at an online auction. That engine, the weathered emblem, the curve of the tank, everything confirmed what her sharp memory was telling her. When Bob came back in, shrugging off his wet jacket, Ivy quietly approached him. "Uncle, that bike. Did you see the model?" she asked softly. "I did. It's collector stuff. No idea what a guy like that is doing on this road." "He seems sad," Ivy murmured, still gazing out the window. Bob grumbled something inaudible and headed to the back of the house to get tools. Caleb, sitting on the cracked leather sofa, held the teacup in both hands, watching the steam rise. He felt out of place here. It wasn't just the cold or the pain in his arm. It was this place, so simple, so quiet, and that girl who had looked at him in a way no one had in a long time. Not with fear, not with judgment, but with genuine curiosity. Ivy passed by to retrieve the damp towel he had left on the armrest. He wanted to thank her, but she just nodded, not looking directly at him. He stayed silent. He didn't know what to ask. He didn't want to seem intrusive, but that veil, that look. Before he could say anything, Bob returned with a rag to mop up the mud at the entrance. "You'll need to leave the bike here for a few days," he said. "I can fix it, I know what I'm doing. I've worked on things like this before, but one of these, it'll take time." "That's fine. I appreciate it. I didn't even know anyone lived out here." "Not many people. Even fewer who like to talk," Bob replied, staring at him. Caleb got the message and just nodded. The garage door slammed shut. The rain had eased, but the sky remained heavy. The sound of water running through the gutters was the only noise in the room. Ivy came back in, this time with a dry cloth for the floor. As she knelt to clean, Caleb noticed how deliberate her movements were, almost ceremonial. She moved with a lightness, as if she didn't want to take up too much space in the world. "Thanks for the tea," he said at last. She only smiled with her eyes, and Caleb had the strange feeling that if he stayed there long enough, he might learn a language made only of silences. Bob cleared his throat. "There's a room in the back. Simple, but it's dry. You can sleep there tonight." "I really appreciate it." Bob turned to Ivy. "Show him the way." She hesitated for a second, then nodded. Caleb followed her down the narrow hallway, lined with old furniture, worn curtains, and the scent of damp wood. In the room, a twin bed with clean sheets and a folded wool blanket. "This'll do. Better than the floor," Caleb joked, trying to lighten the mood. Ivy looked at him briefly. For the first time, their eyes truly met, and for a moment, something lingered in the air. A silent understanding, a fragile bridge forming between two people who, until now, had lived as if invisible. She left without a word, and Caleb alone lay down on the bed and closed his eyes. Even with his body aching, even with the rain still falling outside, even without fully understanding what had just happened that night, he knew something had changed. He just didn't know what. Not yet. Ivy folded the blanket slowly, her fingers gliding over the worn fabric. The room was quiet, except for the distant sound of rain dripping from the eaves of the house. It was still early. The sun hadn't fully risen, but she was already awake. She couldn't sleep. The face of the man from the night before, the stranger with the Harley, was still vivid in her mind. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the veil hanging on the chair. Gently, she picked it up and placed it over her face. The habit was stronger than any desire for change. Since childhood, she had felt safer this way, shielded by a piece of cloth between herself and the world. She walked down the stairs barefoot, silently, as she always did. The house was still, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee was already drifting from the kitchen. Bob had probably been up for hours. Passing by the mirror in the hallway, she paused for a moment. The reflection showed her eyes, the tip of her nose covered by the veil, and the shadow of the scars still visible beneath the light fabric. She touched her face with her fingers, tracing the uneven line that ran from the side of her forehead down to her left cheek. It didn't hurt anymore, at least not physically. She closed her eyes, and suddenly everything came rushing back. The sound of the fire alarm, the flames climbing the staircase, the smoke, the screams, her father's arms pushing her out the back door before going back to try to save her mother. And the silence. The silence that followed when she woke up days later in the hospital, wrapped in bandages, hearing the doctor say that neither of them had survived. At 11 years old, Ivy was an orphan. Bob, her mother's older brother, was the only relative who showed up at the hospital to take her. He didn't talk much, never asked how she was feeling, but he cleaned her wounds every day, put food on the table, and taught her what he knew: engines, tools, grease, and survival. "The world's too rough for soft people, Ivy," he used to say while showing her how to take apart a carburetor. She didn't understand it then. Over time, she stopped trying to understand and just accepted it. She got good with machines, better than she'd expected. When working on engines, she felt in control. Everything had logic, everything made sense. School was different. In the early years, she tried going back. She wore the veil to hide her face, but the other kids laughed. They called her Burn Girl, a veiled witch, hidden monster. The teachers didn't know how to handle it. The looks of pity were almost as painful as the cruel laughter. By 8th grade, she stopped going. Bob didn't object. He just bought some used books and taught her how to find answers on her own. It was a different world, quieter, safer. There she could be herself, without having to defend herself all the time. She taught herself literature, history, geography. But what fascinated her most was the world of engines. She followed online forums, read technical articles, watched old videos on classic motorcycle restoration. One day, she saw a video about the 1908 strap tank. It was like a jewel on two wheels. That image had stuck in her mind ever since, and that's why when she saw that motorcycle being pulled into her garage, something stirred inside her. Curiosity, yes, but also something more. A restlessness. A feeling that the encounter might actually mean something. In the next room, Caleb was slowly getting up. The night before had left his body sore, but manageable. He put on his wrinkled t-shirt and walked to the small kitchen of the rental house further down the same road. The coffee he'd made was bitter but hot. He sat at the table, opened the voice memo app on his phone, and started speaking, more to himself than to any real recipient. "I crashed my bike in the middle of a dirt road during a storm and ended up in the house of an old guy who looks like he stepped out of a western and a girl who won't show her face. But she looked at me like she actually saw something, and it was just one look, but it broke me." He went quiet for a few seconds, staring at the recorder as if expecting it to answer. "It's funny. The whole world thinks they know me. Magazine covers, headlines, youngest CEO of a global holding company. And now all that's left of me is this: a scratched arm, a damaged motorcycle, and an overwhelming desire to be nobody." He stood up and walked to the mirror in the living room, stared at his own face, freshly shaved in a rush, tired eyes, no visible marks, no apparent scars. But he knew it was there. The scar of watching his fiancée die in an accident caused by a drunk employee from his own company. The pain of being accused of financial motives. The shame of being judged by eyes that never truly saw him. "People think I have everything," he whispered, "but all I have is emptiness." He closed the app and took a deep breath. Ivy. The girl with the veil wouldn't leave his mind, but it wasn't about curiosity anymore. It was the way she looked, unfiltered, the quiet strength, the complete absence of vanity. And then it hit him. It wasn't empathy, it wasn't admiration, it was love. Something still forming. Something that didn't scream but grew too powerfully to be ignored. And he knew with painful clarity, I want to go back there, not for the bike, but for her. Meanwhile, Ivy sat back down at the kitchen table. Bob had already left, as he did every morning, never saying where he was going. She picked up her notebook and began absent-mindedly sketching the lines of the Harley's tank. It was as if she wanted to capture every detail before it vanished. She looked out the window, watching the cloudy sky gradually lighten. The motorcycle was there in the garage, the stranger too, and suddenly the world felt a little less distant, a little less unreachable. She didn't know what she was going to do with that feeling, but she knew she didn't want to keep hiding the same way anymore. It wasn't courage yet, but it was a beginning. The sound of the jackhammer echoed in the distance, coming from the main road. Caleb shut the sliding glass door firmly and turned on the air conditioner. The morning heat was stifling, even beneath the trees of the hillside. Sitting at the table with his laptop open, he tried to respond to the backlog of emails, but his focus slipped away like sand through his fingers. His eyes kept drifting in the same direction, the dirt road where Bob and Ivy's house stood. He couldn't stop thinking about her. Or rather, about that moment when she identified the motorcycle with such precision that it had left him speechless. It was as if he'd discovered a new language, spoken in whispers, yet reaching something whole and untouched deep inside him. He shut the laptop and grabbed his phone. He reached out to one of the caretakers of the property, a local man with a gentle voice who'd handled maintenance for years. "Hey, Carlos. Quick question. Who lives in the house just before ours?" The more isolated one, with the makeshift garage in the back. There was a brief pause on the other end. "Oh, that's Bob's place. Bob Martin's. Bit of a grump, but good guy. Lives with his niece. Ivy, I think her name is." "Ivy?" "Yeah. Poor thing. Her family died in a fire when she was little. She only survived because her dad got her out in time. She was left with some serious scars. Never showed her face in public again. Been living there with her uncle ever since. Caleb felt a chill run down his spine. She never left the house? They say she studied online, didn't talk to anyone. When she was younger, they tried putting her in the local school, but people around here can be cruel. After that, she disappeared off the radar. Caleb thanked him and hung up, the phone still in his hand. So that was it. That girl who spoke with her eyes and recognized a strap tank better than most experts was a survivor too. Different scars, yes, but just as deep. He threw on a light shirt, ran a hand through his hair and stepped outside. He had to go back. He had to see her again, and not just because of the motorcycle. The walk was short. Within minutes, he was knocking on the door of the modest house with the wooden porch. He expected Bob, but it was Ivy who opened it. She hesitated when she saw him, clearly surprised. Her eyes widened slightly, but she stepped back and tightened the veil around her face. "Good morning," he said with a cautious smile. "Is your uncle home?" "He went into town. Needed a part for the bike. He won't be back until later." Her voice was soft, sweet, but tinged with a nervousness Caleb recognized. "Ah, I see. I just came to check on the bike, see if everything's okay with it. It's in the garage. He left some parts disassembled, but he'll finish today if he finds the right piece." A moment of awkward silence followed. "Mind if I wait here?" he asked casually. "Don't want to be a bother, of course." She glanced inside the house, then back at him. She seemed to weigh the risks, like someone deciding whether to retreat or move forward. "Would you like some coffee?" Caleb smiled. "I'd love some." "Thanks." She stepped away, leaving him on the porch. When she returned holding 2 cups, he was still standing, taking in the view. They sat right there on simple wooden chairs. "It's strong," he said after the first sip, smiling slightly. She gave a quiet half-laugh. "My uncle likes it that way, says weak coffee is lying coffee." I might steal that line. Silence returned, but it felt lighter now. Caleb tried not to stare at the veil, but his curiosity was inevitable, and at the same time, respectful. He sensed this wasn't the moment to ask, maybe it never would be. But he couldn't ignore her presence, strong, grounded, intense. He turned slightly, looking toward the side of the house. "That bike, it's a strap tank, right?" Ivy nodded. 1908, she said at last. "One of the first Harley models. Only a few left in the world. One sold at auction a few years ago. Almost $1 million. Caleb raised his eyebrows. "Wow, you really know your bikes." She looked down shyly. "I grew up around engines. My uncle taught me since I was little. It's what we did together." "You spoke like a pro, better than a lot of mechanics I've met." She blushed beneath the veil, but didn't answer. "Where'd you learn all that?" "Books, forums, old videos. Studying was all I had left, when going outside stopped being an option." He leaned forward slightly, eyes attentive. "Because of the fire." She paused, took a deep breath, then answered, almost in a whisper, "Because of people." The words hung in the air like an open wound. Caleb didn't dare interrupt. "I tried, at first, going back to school, making friends, but it was worse than being alone. So I figured it was easier this way. Hiding felt safer." "Is that why you wear the veil?" She didn't answer, but she didn't have to. The silence was enough. "I know what it's like to hide," he said after a moment. "Not with veils, but with walls. Walls you build on the inside." She looked at him more directly, for the first time, and something shifted. A recognition, as if they had truly seen each other in that moment. Caleb leaned back in his chair, gazing up at the clear sky. "That motorcycle, it brought more than broken parts, didn't it?" Ivy almost smiled. "Maybe it fixed something I didn't even know could be fixed." They sat there for several minutes, sharing the silence like two survivors of different battles, carrying the same weariness on their shoulders. And in that moment, without the need for touch or declarations, something began to grow between them. Something light but real. A quiet respect. A first crack in the walls they had both built. The metallic clang of the truck door echoed across the property. Bob had just parked the old Hilux beside the makeshift garage. The hood was coated in dust, but he didn't care. He stepped out of the vehicle with a box of parts in his hands, sweat on his face from the afternoon heat. The sun was already dipping behind the hills, painting the sky a muted orange. "Got the part," he announced, heading straight into the garage where Ivy and Caleb had been for a while, analyzing the Harley's frame. Caleb turned, wiping his hands with a shop rag, and smiled. Excellent. This thing was starting to feel like an unsolvable puzzle. "Only looks that way," Bob replied curtly. To someone who doesn't know what they're doing, even turning a screw feels like a mystery. Ivy held back a laugh. Bob had that rough-around-the-edges style, gruff and grumpy, but deep down he was one of the most decent men she knew. And truth be told, he liked to act grumpier than he really was. She stood beside Caleb with the side of the tank opened up, studying the fuel system connection. "If this part fits like the measurements say, it's going to work," she said, focused. Bob set the box down on the workbench and opened it carefully, revealing the missing component. "Found it at a scrapyard in the next town. Had to dig through half the county, but I got it." Ivy took the part in both hands and examined every detail with an expert eye. "This is it. It's going to fit perfectly." 3 days later, the warehouse had already turned into a kind of quiet refuge for the two of them. Caleb started showing up frequently, always at the same time, always with some excuse, sometimes just to watch, other times to get his hands dirty alongside Ivy. He was clumsy with the tools at first, but he learned quickly, or pretended not to know, just to hear her patiently explain. Bob pretended not to notice the billionaire's frequent visits, but he noticed. Every time he saw the two of them laughing over some old part, every time Caleb started a conversation just to stay a little longer, every time Ivy let her guard down without realizing it, Bob saw it all and kept it to himself. That afternoon, the work went smoothly. They installed the part with precision. Caleb spun the crankshaft, Ivy tightened the bolts, Bob watched from the corner, pretending to be busy with something else. The rhythm between the three of them was quiet, but effective. "Done," Ivy said, stepping back and wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. "Now we just start her up and see if she purrs." Caleb carefully climbed onto the bike, positioned his hands, and turned the ignition. The engine coughed once, then again, and finally roared to life as if awakening from a decades-long sleep. The sound filled the space with something almost alive. Caleb grinned in disbelief. "That's music." "That's good work," Bob corrected, though deep down he was just as satisfied. Ivy crossed her arms and looked at the bike like an artist admiring a piece they'd helped restore. "I've never seen one of these run that clean," she murmured. Caleb stepped down and looked at her. "All thanks to you and your uncle, of course." Bob, already heading toward the house, paused for a second. "Just doing my job." And with that, he walked inside without another word. Night settled in gently. Ivy and Caleb were still sitting on the porch steps, each with a mug of hot tea in hand. The moon peeked through the clouds, and the air carried a faint scent of damp grass. "Has he always been like that?" Caleb asked, glancing toward the closed front door. "Always guarded, but that's how he cares. He doesn't know how to do it with words." "Does he know you're special?" Ivy smiled, a little surprised. "He's never said it, but I think so." Caleb looked at her for a few moments, then turned his eyes to the open field ahead. "You know you are, right?" She hesitated, took longer than she would have liked to answer. "I'm starting to believe it." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful, full of things unspoken but deeply felt, as if words were unnecessary right then. A few minutes later, Bob opened the front door and stood in the doorway, staring at them. "Ivy, come in for a minute." She nodded, handed her mug to Caleb and stepped inside. Bob waited with his arms crossed. "You two are getting close." She just nodded again. "I'm not saying it's wrong," he began, choosing his words carefully, "but I want you to keep your eyes open. Not every man who smiles at you wants to stay, and you You've got too good a heart to give away like that." Ivy took a deep breath. "I can take care of myself, Uncle." "I know you can, but you've never had to. You get that?" She looked at him firmly and with affection. "Maybe this is the first time, and maybe I need to feel things to know if they're right or not." Bob was quiet for a moment, then simply nodded. "Just don't let anyone dim you again, Ivy. It took too long for you to light back up." She smiled, touched. "Thank you." She returned to the porch where Caleb was still waiting. He looked at her like he knew that moment with Bob had meant something. He didn't ask anything, just handed her the mug of tea. She sat beside him, closer this time. The Harley rested in the garage, flawless. But that night, it wasn't the bike that had been repaired. It was something much deeper, something that had started to stir inside them both, even if it didn't have a name yet. The bell above the grocery store door jingled as Caleb walked in, wiping his rain-specked sunglasses from the light drizzle falling over town. The place was small, lined with old wooden shelves and the comforting smell of freshly brewed coffee. A few heads turned toward him, as they always did. No one had to ask who he was. The stranger from the new house, the billionaire outsider, the man with the Harley. He walked up to the counter and ordered the usual fresh bread, cheese, and a box of tea. As he waited, he caught the low voices of two older women whispering behind a shelf of cookies. "Did you see him the other day near that girl's house?" "I did. They were sitting on the porch together, very close. I thought it was odd." "Odd? That's more than odd. It's dangerous. A girl like her, alone her whole life. And him? A man who could have anyone he wants. You really think that's a coincidence?" Caleb didn't react, but his stomach twisted. The box of tea in his hand suddenly felt heavier. He thanked the clerk, walked out in silence, and made his way slowly to the rented pickup truck. The gray sky matched how he felt. It wasn't a surprise people were talking. What stung was knowing Ivy probably already knew. And yet, she remained open, kind, and more present in his life every day. On the drive back, the sound of the engine was muffled by a storm of thoughts. The women's words echoed as if trying to carve doubt into what he felt. But there was no doubt. He knew what was happening between him and Ivy. He knew it wasn't some fleeting whim. When he pulled into the property, he saw Bob hosing down the Hilux with a rusted garden hose. The old man looked up, said nothing, and went back to what he was doing. Ivy was in the garage, polishing the chrome side of the Harley with a soft cloth. She wore a loose flannel shirt, jeans cuffed at the ankle, and her ever-present veil. But Caleb could already see beyond the fabric. He saw the strength she kept hidden, the gentleness in the way she touched the world, the constant glow in her eyes that she tried so hard to conceal. "Brought more tea," he announced as he stepped in. She looked up and smiled with her eyes. "Good. The old man's going to burn through the house supply in 3 days." He laughed, and she went back to her task. The sound of the cloth rubbing metal was almost soothing. "You know," Caleb said after a few minutes of silence, "they're talking about us in town." Ivy paused but didn't look up right away. "I figured. It's not fair to you." "Nothing ever has been," she replied simply, continuing to polish. Caleb stepped closer. "Does it bother you?" She thought for a moment, then answered, "No more than usual. They've said worse about me. Sometimes I think I prefer it when they talk, instead of pretending I don't exist." The words landed like a punch to the chest. Caleb swallowed. "I just want to protect you from that," he said, his voice softer. "I don't need protection. I need truth, someone who doesn't run when they see me up close." He stepped even closer, lowering his voice. "I'm not running." She finally looked at him. The look they exchanged said more than anything either of them had ever said. Across the property, Bob turned off the hose and started walking back toward the house. But before going inside, he turned slightly and saw the scene. Ivy and Caleb in the garage, close, connected. He let out a long breath and wiped his damp face. This was getting too deep, and he knew the world too well. He knew how stories like this usually ended for girls like Ivy. Hours later that night, he called his niece in to talk. They sat at the kitchen table, the warm yellow light from the ceiling casting slow-moving shadows. "He's into you," Bob said bluntly. I know, Ivy answered without hesitation. And you? I like him too. You ever had this before? No. Then you don't know what it is. She looked at him, steady. But I know how I feel. I know how he makes me feel. And I know I've never felt this way before. Bob rubbed his hands together, thinking, I just don't want to see you get hurt. I don't want him leaving and making a hole bigger than the one you've spent your whole life trying to fill. Maybe he won't leave. Maybe he'll stay. Bob shook his head. He's rich. You really think people like him stay? He's lost things too, Uncle. He carries scars, just like I do. Maybe he's just looking for someone who understands that. And maybe I'm that person. Bob didn't reply. He just looked at her for a long moment. The next morning, Caleb was in the shed organizing a few motorcycle parts. Bob walked in without knocking, his face unreadable. I know you and Ivy are getting close, he said. And I know I can't stop that. Caleb stopped what he was doing and looked up. I care about her. Then prove it. Because the one thing she's had too much of in life is people who left. Don't be another one. Caleb nodded slowly. I'm not leaving. The silence between them was thick but respectful. Two very different men slowly starting to understand each other. That same day, while Ivy was organizing the shelf in the living room, she found an old folder of medical documents. She opened it out of curiosity. Inside were reports from the time of the fire, prescriptions, test results, and a quote for reconstructive surgery. A note in red read, "Procedure exceeds the family's financial capacity." She read the paper again and again, as if it were a sentence carved in stone. She'd never complained, never asked for anything. But she had always known that changing what she saw in the mirror was a dream too far. That evening, Caleb walked in with 2 cups of tea. You okay? I'm fine, she lied, offering a small smile, but he saw the weight in her eyes, and right then, in silence, he decided he would do something about it. He didn't know how yet, but he knew she deserved to see in the mirror what he saw every time he looked at her, even if she didn't know it yet, even if the whole world doubted it, even if he had to fight everything, including the fear she'd carried for so long. The pen glided firmly across the paper as Caleb signed the last form. The office was quiet, decorated in neutral tones with a faint scent of lavender in the air. Across the desk, the surgeon, a man with a measured voice and a clinical gaze, collected the documents and nodded. It's all confirmed. The surgery can be scheduled within 3 weeks. The pre-op tests have already been ordered. The team is aware she's a private patient and will ensure total discretion. Caleb thanked him with a firm handshake. Stepping out of the building, he took a deep breath. The late afternoon sun was hot on his skin, but he felt a cool kind of relief inside. He hadn't told Ivy, not yet. He knew she'd be afraid, knew that if he told her in advance, she might refuse. So he chose to do what he knew best, take action. No fanfare, no promises, just the one thing he could offer, an opportunity. Over the following days, Caleb kept up the same routine with Ivy. They still met in the garage, still shared tea on the porch, still walked among the barns at dusk. The only difference was the secret he carried in his chest, like a seed about to break through the soil. It was on a colder night, after a long silence between them, that he finally spoke. Ivy, I need to tell you something. She stopped cleaning the lens of the old headlight and looked at him, tense. I scheduled a surgery for you. Time froze. Ivy's eyes widened, and she immediately looked away. You did what? Her voice was low but firm. I saw the documents, the denied estimate, the old medical report, and I thought, maybe now it could be possible. That doesn't give you the right, Caleb, she said, taking a step back. It's not just cosmetic. It's not vanity. I know. I'm not trying to erase who you are. What if I do it, and I don't like who I become? What if I lose the only part of me that ever made me strong? Caleb stepped closer, calmly. You're not going to lose anything, but you will gain something, the chance to choose. That's all. Ivy stayed silent for a long time. Her eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling. Give me a few days. He nodded. And just 3 nights later, without a word, she walked out to the porch where he was drinking tea and said, "I'll do it. But not because you scheduled it, because now I want to try." The following days were filled with tests, consultations, evaluations, and adjustments. Caleb drove her to the city at off hours to avoid attention. Ivy wore her veil whenever they went out, but her posture had changed. She stood taller, more certain. Bob watched it all with a mix of worry and pride. One night, he pulled Caleb aside for a brief, straight-to-the-point conversation. "She looks scared, but she looks alive too. She has every reason to feel both. Take care of her. Always." On the night before the surgery, Ivy sat on the porch, eyes fixed on the horizon. Caleb came over and sat beside her. "Everything's ready," he said. "Just waiting on you." "I'm scared," she admitted, not looking away. "That's normal. Fear doesn't go away. We just learn to walk with it." She turned her face toward him. "You really think this will change anything?" "It'll change how you see yourself, and that changes everything." She nodded slowly. After a while, she rested her head on his shoulder. The next morning, Caleb waited at the hospital. The lobby was quiet when Ivy walked in, her steps slow, the veil around her face, hands trembling on her bag strap. He stood the moment he saw her. "Ready?" "I don't think I ever will be, but let's go." The pre-op went smoothly. The team had been fully briefed. They treated Ivy with calm professionalism, no pity, no drama. Just before entering the OR, she looked at Caleb, standing by the door. "What if I wake up and don't like who I see?" "Then I'll remind you who you are," he said, holding her hand. "Because I already see all of you. You just need to see it too." She smiled for the first time that day. A small smile, but real. She stepped into the room with her heart racing, but her soul lighter than ever. Caleb stayed there, sitting, staring at the closed door. He waited for hours, but time felt suspended. He thought of everything they'd been through, that first glance, the simple coffee, the garage, the day she said she'd rather be talked about than ignored, and the moment she began to let herself exist, fully. When the door opened and the doctor came out with a soft smile, Caleb stood immediately. "Everything went well. She's doing great. Now she just needs to rest and wait." He nodded, relieved, and thanked him. Hours after the surgery, Ivy woke up alone in the room. When she saw her reflection in the mirror for the first time, she froze. The face was hers, but different. Familiar and strange. And then the cruel thought came, what if he only loved me like that? That afternoon, she didn't leave the room. She didn't respond to Caleb. When he finally walked in, he saw the fear in her eyes. "If you only liked me with the veil." All of this was for nothing. "Ivy," he said, kneeling beside her, "I fell in love when you could barely look at me, when your pain was still a wall." She looked at him, tears falling. "I needed to hear that. Now you have." They embraced, not as a new beginning, but as a certainty. The night had passed, and something inside them had too. Ivy's footsteps echoed softly across the wooden porch as the door creaked open. The morning breeze swept across the fields and brushed her face gently, as if even nature hesitated to disturb her in that moment. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting soft shadows, and there, before the world that had frightened her for so long, she took her first step. Without the veil, her hands trembled, her heart raced. She could feel every invisible gaze from the landscape upon her, as though even the silence of the earth bore witness to what was unfolding. Bob, who was working on the Hilux near the garage, slowly looked up at the sound of the door. His eyes took a second to recognize her. Ivy looked different. She was still herself, with delicate features and those large, expressive eyes, but something had changed, not just outwardly. The scar, once deep and prominent, was now a soft memory on her skin. But the real change was the light that came from within. She was a new woman, not because she'd been reconstructed, but because at last she had allowed herself to exist. Bob set down the lug wrench and stood upright. "Ivy, She smiled, and the gesture came with confidence, almost surprising to both of them. "Hi, Uncle." He didn't move. His eyes glistened, but he said nothing more. Just nodded as if to say, "I see you, truly." Moments later, Caleb appeared at the end of the dirt path. He'd walked as he often did now, not just to arrive, but to feel the way there. When he saw Ivy standing in front of the house, he stopped. His feet froze in place for a second. She saw him, and then walked toward him. No hurry, no veil, nothing hidden. Each step seemed to undo a wall. One by one, the bricks of fear and shame fell away, and in their place, a quiet bridge rose between them. Caleb stopped just a few feet from her, his eyes locked on hers. There was no shock, no surprise. Only a rare kind of awe, the kind that comes when beauty doesn't astonish, but confirms what the heart already knew. He began, but stopped. Words failed. Ivy took a deep breath, her eyes shining. "I'm still me. And still the most beautiful woman I've ever seen." She smiled, and her eyes filled with tears she no longer tried to hide. He reached out, his hand slow, almost reverent. She placed hers on top, and he gently pulled her into a warm, meaningful embrace. For the first time, she didn't turn her face away. Instead, she rested it against his chest, as if she had finally found a place where she could rest, without fear. Their first kiss came in silence, born of respect and understanding. It was soft, but sure, the meeting of two worlds, patched together by time, now whole. When they pulled apart, they were smiling, not with sudden joy, but with the calm happiness of people who had survived too much and still chose love. From the porch, Bob watched them. There was no tension on his face anymore, only a strange light in his eyes and a steady hand resting on the railing, as if at last he understood that the girl he'd raised in fear had grown, and now stood beside someone who saw her beyond the scars. Later that day, Ivy went into town for the first time without covering her face. The sidewalks that once felt threatening were now just ordinary paths. People, of course, looked, some with surprise, others with curiosity. But Ivy held her head high, her gaze steady, like someone who had faced far worse than stares. At the grocery store, the same woman who had whispered cruel gossip weeks before froze when she saw Ivy enter with Caleb. But there was no confrontation, no need to prove anything. Ivy simply walked to the counter, bought her favorite tea and left hand in hand with him. The town's silence spoke louder than 1,000 words. They saw her, and she was ready to be seen. On the way back, the two walked slowly, unrushed. "You know what I realized today?" Ivy said, fiddling with the paper bag from the store. "What?" "That I was never invisible. I was just hiding from the wrong people. You don't have to hide anymore. Now, I choose when I want to be seen. And today I want to be." Caleb stopped, pulled her gently by the waist and rested his forehead against hers. "I saw you from the first day, when no one else did." She closed her eyes, smiling. "And now, I see me too." The sky was starting to glow orange. The golden light touched her hair like a living frame, and the breeze played with the ends of her loose blouse. Ivy was home, in her body, in the world, in her life. For the first time, whole. When they reached the house, Bob was sitting in the shade with a bottle of iced tea and 2 mugs beside him. "Sit down. Sun's too beautiful to waste it indoors." Ivy and Caleb sat with him like a strange new family, but somehow perfect. And there they stayed. No veils, no fear. Only the sound of the Harley in the background and the peaceful silence of people who knew that, from now on, there was nothing left to hide. The deep rumble of the engine filled the sleepy morning air, breaking the silence of the fields with a presence that felt almost ceremonial. The Harley-Davidson, now fully restored and gleaming, rolled slowly down the dirt road, with Caleb at the wheel and Ivy seated behind him, her arms wrapped firmly around his waist, her hair loose and dancing in the wind. The newly risen sun bathed the sky in a warm gold, lighting up every curve of the motorcycle and every quiet smile on their faces. Ivy wore a light leather jacket, her face free and glowing, her gaze full of something she'd never had before: freedom. The road wound through the hills, flanked by old fences and trees just beginning to bloom. With every turn, a new piece of the world revealed itself, as if it were the first time she was truly seeing it, and in many ways, it was. Behind them, the dust rose slowly, like a trail left by those who had finally chosen to move forward. "You doing okay back there?" Caleb shouted, turning his head slightly. "Never been better," Ivy called back, her voice strong enough to rise above the wind. "Keep going." He smiled and sped up, letting the road sing beneath the tires. For hours they rode. They stopped at roadside stations, drank coffee from a thermos, took grainy photos in a rusted photo booth at a forgotten diner. Ivy laughed easily now, as if a long-lost childhood had found its way back into her gestures. "Never thought I'd feel the wind on my face like this," she said, climbing off the bike at an impromptu lookout where the ocean had just begun to appear on the horizon. "Never thought you'd be here someday?" "Never thought there was a here for me," she answered, eyes fixed on the deep blue ahead. Caleb stepped behind her, rested his hands gently on her shoulders, and said softly, "This world was always here for you. It was just waiting for you to arrive." Ivy placed her hands over his, and together they stood watching the sea. The sound of the waves was still faint, but it was enough to send chills down her arms. It was the first time she'd seen the ocean, the first time she'd seen the world with no veils, not on her face and not in her soul. They rode down to a rustic inn by the beach. Caleb had already reserved it, a simple cabin with a porch facing the sea. Ivy stepped inside and stood in the center of the room, slowly turning her gaze to take in every detail. She touched the curtain fabric, ran her hand along the wooden window frame, and finally opened the door to the porch. Outside, the ocean stretched out, vast, alive, open, and somehow it felt made just for her. "You can walk on the sand whenever you want," Caleb said, leaning against the doorway. She looked at him, hesitant, as if still needing permission to step into a dream. "Come with me?" "Always." They walked down the wooden steps in silence. Ivy slipped off her shoes, sank her feet into the soft, warm sand, and let out a sigh that carried years of silence. Caleb took off his shoes too and walked beside her, watching each of her reactions like a witness to something sacred. "It's warm," she said, surprised, "and soft. I thought it would be rougher." The world always feels harder than it is, when you're only seeing it from a distance. She turned to him, her eyes moist. "Thank you." "For what?" "For bringing me here, for not giving up on me, for seeing me when I couldn't." Caleb stopped and held her face in both hands. The wind swept through her hair, and the salty breeze clung to her lashes. "The world can see you now, Ivy, but I saw you first." She closed her eyes and let him kiss her there, at the edge of the sea, their feet in the sand, their hearts exposed and whole. And in that kiss there was no rush, no fear, no pain, only love, the kind that takes time, that heals old wounds, and takes root where once there was only scorched earth. They stayed there for a long while, walking hand in hand, letting the waves wash over their steps. Ivy ran along the shoreline, laughed loudly, spun with her arms wide open like someone newly born. Caleb watched her with misty eyes and a smile that needed no words. Back at the inn, they sat on the porch with 2 mugs of hot tea. The sun began to set, tinting the ocean in shades of orange. "What do we do now?" she asked, her head resting on his shoulder. "We live," Caleb replied. "One day at a time, no veils, no fear." She nodded slowly, as if finally understanding what that promise really meant. And when night fell, with stars scattered above the sea, Ivy knew, with absolute certainty, that she was no longer the girl who hid. She was the woman who had been seen, loved, and set free. And now, she was ready to see the whole world right back. Hear what it meant to you. Remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons. This is really important for the channel. Really important. And if you're ready for another story of love and hope, click the first card or the second one to watch the full playlist. See you there.